Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this expert panel on public sector leadership. My name is Louis Ranger, and I will have the privilege this afternoon to moderate the session. At the outset, on a personal note, let me say, as a former Deputy Minister of Transport in Canada, it's a real pleasure to be here as Canada assumes the presidency for this forum on a theme that our team at Transport Canada was very much involved in selecting, and I'd like to recognize the team at Transport Canada for their efforts in the last 2 years in promoting the theme. So there we are. This is the power of ideas. If you look at your program, there's a very simple statement of purpose for the session. It is to investigate the role of public policy in the innovation process and investigate how policy can be designed to fulfill that role. Implied in that simple statement is the assumption that perhaps we need to go beyond the traditional framework policies to promote innovation, and perhaps we need to steer innovation in a particular direction. And as I focused on that theme myself, I discovered that there's a nice academic debate, particularly among economists, as to whether this is the right thing to do. So I suspect that in one form or another, this debate will come up. Obviously, the topic today is much broader than that. And again, if you look at the program, there's a list of questions that were provided to our panelists to help them prepare for this session. What I would like to suggest, the biographies of our panel members are or will be available. So in the interest of time, I will quickly introduce them simply by name and title, and then we'll tell you how we will proceed. And we're trying to be a bit innovative here, and we'll perhaps do something a bit different than was done in other panels. So our panel members, in the order in which they are sitting from your left to your right, Ms. Tara Alice, who's Chief Economist with the UK Department for Transport. Next, Ms. Charlotte Brogren, just arriving from China, who's Director General, Swedish Government Agency for Innovation Systems. To my right, Jean-Éric Paquet, who's Acting Director, Trans-European Transport Networks and Smart Transport in the DG for Mobility and Transport with the European Commission. To my left, Mr. Dirk Pilot, who's Division Head, Science, Technology and Industry at the OECD. To his left, Mr. Michael Robson, Secretary General, European Rail Infrastructure Managers. And last but not least, Professor Sanjeevi Sundar, who's a distinguished fellow at the University at the Energy and Resources Institute of India. So, a warm welcome to our panelists. Now, here's how I propose to moderate this session. Having been participating to these events for many years, and there's always a challenge to make sure there's a debate, and there's a tendency for things to be scripted too much. So at the risk of being innovative, I will try to get as much from the audience as we can, and yet give an opportunity to our speakers to present their initial remarks. So what I will propose is we divide up the presentations in two blocks. Starting with three panelists, Ms. Brogren, Mr. Pilot, and Professor Sundar, who will present their initial remarks in no more than 5 minutes. And then I will move to the audience and invite comments and questions, and everybody should feel free, including every panel member, to jump in that discussion. And that after 10 or 15 minutes or so, I will then come back and ask the three other panelists in the following order, Ms. Alice, Mr. Paquet, and Mr. Robson, to introduce make their preliminary remarks, and then carry on with the questions from the floor. So, in the interest of time, I would suggest that we do just that, and starting with Ms. Brogan. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't think it's working.
No.
Try this one. Maybe, yeah.
Thanks. Okay, my name is Charlotte Brogren, and I have the pleasure to be responsible for a governmental agency in Sweden called Vinnova. And we have the objective to fund innovation. It's not innovation system, but activities that leads to innovation in Sweden that can contribute to the future welfare as well as the competitiveness. I'd like to start my presentation here by giving a little bit global perspective. And as you all know, there are quite a few radical changes that are happening around us, have been happening for a few years, and the pace of the change is really accelerating. We talk about the growth of population, we talk about the change of population over the world, the demographics, global warming, lack of resources, clean water, and et cetera, et cetera. And as the famous actor Woody Allen says, is that innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity instead of a threat. And looking at the changes that we actually have, it's really a time, it really puts the need to really invest in innovation, both to solve the important issues that we are facing, but also in the same time activities that really can help us to stay competitive in the future. And it's extremely important that when we talk about this that we try to solve the both issues at the same time, so that we see that there are both solving critical issues for the future as well, but not forgetting that we actually have to continue to stay competitive if we would like to have money to further invest into this. As was said here, I'm just coming from China, where I spent a week. I spent a lot of time in China and India over the past 7-8 years. And when you see the determination in these countries to really go into it, really change the countries. I mean, China has really put up a lot of efforts here to going from the world's factory, the source of all low-cost production, into the world's largest pool of know-how and human capital. And when you see the activities that the state and the various agencies are putting into really making this happen, you really get a little bit worried when you're coming back to the comfort zone here in Europe and specifically Sweden, where I often very lack the sense of urgency to go from talking into action. So what do I think we need to do? Of course, there are a number of things, but I would like to pinpoint 4 areas where I think that we can do a lot from the public sector. First of all, we can be much more effective and driving in actually using policies to drive innovation. In Sweden, we have some good examples around the area of safety, congestion control. I think the next step is now really going into the environmental technologies, which is a big concern for the sector. Here we have a lot of technologies available, but we need the spark to really sort of get it into the market in a good way. Second activity where I think the state and the public area can do a lot of things is to drive public procurement, to drive innovation. I think that could be a really instrumental to really get e-mobility, not from the laboratory stage and the wishful thinking into the real life. And public procurement is also a very, very effective means of supporting SMEs to try to drive their innovation. The third area is where we would like to see that we build more test arenas, demonstrators. Many areas here in the area of transportation is really applied, and it's also very much a systematic view. And many of these things you cannot test in lab. It has to go out and be tested in almost real conditions in order for it to come into the market. Sweden has, this test arenas for winter conditions, and we are now looking into areas for active safety, and we also believe that e-mobility, Sweden could be a very good test place, since we have companies that are very good on the electrical side, because we can't forget the infrastructure side and only look at the transportation side. We have to have a systemic view of this issue. And last but not least, we need better coordination of activities across the country borders, because the laws of transportation really doesn't follow the geographical, how we have divided it into various countries. Because we need to look at it from a more of a total optimization instead of on a larger scale than just optimizing it on smaller geographical areas.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's exactly the right time. So, Kirk.
I'll try to do the same.
Yes.
I hope that. My name is Dirk Pilat. I work at the OECD. I work in a slightly different area from a lot of the colleagues for ITF. Over the past few years, I've been working quite a bit on innovation more broadly, and we're actually tomorrow are releasing a report to the OECD's regular ministerial on innovation. And we've tried to look really at innovation in a very broad way, because I think we've had a tendency over the past few years sometimes to look at innovation as very much, well, it's R&D, it's science and technology. And I think what we've realized is that it's a lot broader. I mean, we need to look at innovation often that it's not only about technology, it's how it's combined, how it's being put into the workplace, how it's being combined with services, with other types of innovations in organizations, workplaces, and so on, to really make it work. And I think that is an understanding which is still, whenever you talk to ministers or with policymakers about innovation, often we come back to R&D, we come back to technology and so on. And I think then we're missing the point a little bit. We need to look at it in a much broader sense. A little bit about, well, what is the role of government in this area? I think, frameworks are extremely important. I think if you don't give stable frameworks for companies to innovate in, and you don't give a long-term sense of direction on where you're trying to go with your policies, it's very difficult for companies to make the long-term investments which are needed to really drive innovation. And I think there the role of leadership, a long-term vision, a long-term strategy is extremely important. And I think the example here of China, well, China knows where it's going with this. I mean, they know where they will be probably in 2020. There is a vision here of reaching 2.5% of GDP spent on R&D by 2020, and they're still very steadily going in that direction. I think Korea is another example. We just heard in the previous session about the Korean the mayor of Seoul, who had this vision about changing Seoul. Now he's the president of Korea, and he's had a very strong vision again about where Korea is going. It's called green growth. Again, vision is I think, and leadership is very important. At the same time, if that vision is only top down, it won't work, because a lot of the innovations really have to come from the bottom up, and I think that's extremely important to allow that to happen. A question which is raised a little bit in I think for this session is, well, can governments steer innovation? Well, I think they can. I mean, a lot of governments are steering innovation by tax policy, by regulatory policy, by standards. There are many ways in which basically governments can give incentives to say, well, we won't like to go in a certain direction with our policy. We would like to go in that direction. We would like you to go and think about carbon-free technologies. Here, there is an incentive for you to go in that direction. That's not the only thing. I think there are a lot of other things which governments can do. One finding from the work which we've had is the importance which new firms play. Sometimes very much, many of the really radical ideas, the radical innovations, will typically not come from existing firms. They will typically come from the pioneers, from the people who have very different ideas, have completely things which are coming out of the blue, and suddenly come up with something which will challenge the existing firms, challenge the incumbents, and sometimes really change the way things are being done. And I think to allow those new firms to come true, to make them happen, to make them grow, is something which at least many European countries still have great difficulties in doing. I mean, it's a little bit better in the United States, but it's really a big problem for many European countries. I think the other point is that I think, and the point came up a few times already, is innovation and policies in this area. It's about a system. You're really trying to bring policies together. It's not only about sort of developing the technologies, developing the ideas, developing the new knowledge. It's also how it's being applied in the market and how basically it's meeting the needs of consumers, of users, and so on. And I think many governments are now, I think, more and more thinking about how they can make that combination of what are called supply policies, so really trying to get new technologies into the marketplace with technologies on policies on the demand side to try and improve the way markets are functioning and the way they're being taken up in the marketplace. So regulatory policies, standards policies, all these types of things are extremely important in that context. My final point is about something which I don't think we've talked about a lot here today yet, is that I think there's not a lot of policy learning going on typically. I mean, we don't learn very well from a lot of the mistakes we make in the past. We don't learn very much from what others are doing. We're all looking around for ideas, but it's very difficult, I think, particularly in the public sector, to actually learn from mistakes and say, well, didn't quite work. Let's try to do something a little bit different. We've learned from the mistakes. Evaluate your policies. Think about what you can do differently. And that's difficult, but I think it's really, if we want to take innovation seriously, it's something that needs to be done effectively and much more consistently. Just to finalize, one thing we're currently doing at the OECD as a follow-up of our work is to try and develop something, calling it a handbook. It will not really be a handbook, but really to try and codify a little bit more better what we actually know about innovation, what we know about good practice in this area, what works, what doesn't work, so we can really try to build a little bit on that and make it a living document for everybody to use. I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
No, that's great. And actually, without getting ahead of ourselves, one thing that I was going to say in a moment when I invite comments is those who do want to share best practices, let's hear those stories as well. We're very quick at identifying the gaps or lack of innovations, but there are good stories to tell as well. So this is an opportunity to share those experiences as well. So thank you, Kurt, for that. Professor Sundar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Sundar. I was a career civil servant, last permanent secretary transport in the Government of India. And for some years now, I have been into academics and research with the Energy and Research Institute in New Delhi. The role that the public sector can play in promoting R&D and encouraging innovations has been very effectively argued. I take that case as rested. I would only like to stress the point that Mr. Pilat made, that there is a need also to steer R&D to achieve public policy goals. The future of transport systems, as far as I see, is going to be determined largely by the need for inclusive growth, the compulsions of providing mobility for all, the need for energy efficiency, the need for environmental protection, and the need to address the concerns of climate change. And these are not necessarily the concerns of a profit-seeking service providers in the transport sector. There is a role, there is a need for government to spell out policy objectives and guide direct R&D into achieving these objectives. R&D should also, and R&D funding should also focus on problems that are country-specific. The priorities, I was just listening into the mayors across Europe who spoke very effectively on the initiatives that they have taken to improve transport systems in their cities. But their priorities were very, very different from the priorities in India or China. And unfortunately, the tendency for researchers in developing countries to address the concerns of the developed world and find a place in the referee journals of the developed world continues. This must change, and focus must be on issues that concern countries. I don't wish to be provocative, but I'd like to argue the need for global standards in the automobile industry. There are about 12 to 15 auto majors who are producing vehicles in the developed world, who are also the main producers of vehicles in developing countries like India and China. While they are conforming to the more strict, more stringent safety, energy efficiency, and emission standards of the developed world, because these standards are stringent, they continue to produce less efficient vehicles based on old technology in the developing countries. If a feature is necessary for safety purposes in a vehicle, and that feature, that innovation is available in one part of the world, there is no reason why, as in the case of the aviation industry and the maritime industry, the same feature should not become available in the entire world. If an institution like ICAO or IMO is necessary for that purpose, I think we need to invent it. Perhaps ITF could grow into it, but this should not come in the way of having global standards in the automobile industry. I would also argue that innovation is not only about technology, it is also about public policy, because sustainability and a low carbon path cannot be achieved without innovative public policies. What Enrique Peñalosa did in Bogota or what Ken Livingstone did in London are excellent examples of innovative approaches to policy formulation and implementation. The interventions necessary in cities to avoid travel, to shift to more energy and environmentally friendly modes, to improve vehicle technology and fuel quality are all well known. They have been thoroughly discussed, well documented. Even so, if only a few cities have been able to successfully implement these interventions, it is because city managers have not been able to identify or find the way of adapting these interventions and packaging them to meet their particular city requirements. And this is something that is possible and needs to be done, and we need to recognize that innovative public policies with creative leadership is perhaps just as important, if not even more important, than technological innovations to solve the transportation problems in most cities. The responsibility for planning and managing transport systems in most countries of the world is fragmented. In India, for example, there are as many as 7 or 8 different agencies in each level of government responsible for different aspects of transport planning and management. So an innovation that will bring them all together, something on the lines of what Livingstone did for London, the Greater London Transport Authority, is a necessary innovation to bring about a holistic and integrated approach to the planning and management of transport systems to make them address environmental and climate change concerns. So I'd like to close my intervention by saying that technological interventions by themselves will not solve the problems of transport in the world. They need to be accompanied by a package of policy, regulatory, and institutional frameworks, innovative institutional frameworks to make all this happen. Thank you.
Thank you for that point about this not just being about technological innovation, but perhaps more importantly being about innovative policies, innovative transport policies. The title of this panel is Public Sector Leadership. So leadership towards what? Leadership to accomplish what? And this is why in the program the very first question is about what are those issues or trends that will shape the future of the transport sector, and if we don't like what we see, how can innovative policies help address those issues? So on that note, and on also referring to the point I made earlier about best practices, I would just like to open the discussion, invite comments. And as I said, everybody here should feel free to respond. Perhaps I'd like to ask those who will speak, sir, to identify yourself and then direct your question to either the whole panel or an individual panelist.
My name is Henry Posner. I'm chairman of Iowa Interstate Railroad USA. And to your point about other ways of developing innovation, I'd just like to offer a different perspective, and that is what happened in North America with rail freight, which may not be relevant to many of the discussions here, but let me just tell you how it happened. And that was that what saved the industry in North America was the lack of a public policy and the lack of public funding. And so, by default, the decision was the public policy was to step back and let the marketplace sort everything out. It was brutal, and as a result, we lost a lot of infrastructure which, with the benefit of hindsight, we might have held on to. But for the last number of years, I've been trying to see if there is a receptivity in Europe for that experience. And the lack of progress, I think, could be summarized in the following sentence, and with deference to people's time, I synthesize it as follows. In Europe, the policy has been top-down innovation, which is an oxymoron, with a focus on economic demonopolization, whereas North American experience was bottoms-up innovation based on cultural demonopolization. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in North America, there are 600 privately owned freight railways that are forced to cooperate with each other without public funding because they're constrained by truck competition. It's a brutal discipline, but the end result is that we have a rail freight network which is the envy of the world. And there may be pieces of that which are exportable to places like Europe, even though it's completely different from an operational perspective.
My lips are burning because I feel like commenting on that, but I know what you're referring to, but don't you think the Staggers Act was a transformative decision, and the allowing short line operators to flourish was the best example I could think of providing opportunities to private sector to fill in the gap where the larger railways would fail. In Canada, there's over 70 short line operators. Only one has failed in the last 15 years. Isn't that a good example of creating a framework, an environment where allowing smaller operators to succeed, where the larger firms with huge fixed costs could not make ends meet? Okay, thank you. I'll try not to do this again. It's just, yes?
Sorry, I've been given. Oh, I will certainly give the floor to Eva.
Thank you, Mario. After that, I will give it back to you. My name is Eva Moore, United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Well, first, I would like to have a question to our colleague from OECD. A couple of months ago, somebody told me that, hey, guys in transport, you are the most conservative and the least innovative guys you are. And I asked, okay, fine, logistics service providers are more innovative than transport operators and transport infrastructure managers, fine. But tell me, why are you so sure that you are right? And he said that because I looked up in the OECD indicators that the R&D going to transport is the least compared to all the other sectors. So here is my question. Could you tell us how much is that? Because since then I tried to locate that indicator and I was not able to find, but I haven't spent too much time on that. I would like to also make a comment, and maybe it will come up, and that is for innovation, I think, number one, we have to allow failure. Before going to the UN, I worked in the World Bank, and one of our big problems was that we were asked to be innovative in projects. But as soon as you were a little bit slower than average in project preparation, you were a little bit slower in disbursement, etc., you felt that maybe there is a problem. So you have to allow failure Otherwise, innovation is actually limited. And concerning your question about policy innovations, I've got an example about, it's, I think, a diplomatic innovation. I will not tell you the whole story. I know that Mr. Paki knows about that. And that is the tolerance package introducing the digital tachograph in Europe, when the deadline is already now in July the 16th. Nobody wanted to modify the deadline, but in the end, the governments agreed, and that's the government's big success, agreed not to modify the deadline, keep the deadline, but to have a sort of a tolerance period and a tolerance package. I think in transport, even in policy areas, we may be able to come up from time to time with some innovations. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like... Dirk.
I should probably respond to the question on R&D spending. Probably, I think the transport sector would probably spend relatively little on R&D directly. I think that is something, if you compare it with other sectors of the economy, particularly if you compare it with manufacturing, if you compare it with communication services, with financial services, and a few other services sector, it probably would spend relatively little. That doesn't mean that the sector isn't innovative. And one of the things which we are actually releasing tomorrow is a publication where we've setting out a whole set of new indicators where we're trying to go beyond R&D, because I think there's a lot of innovation happening which doesn't involve R&D, and sometimes the technologies, the ideas, the knowledge comes from outside the sector, and that's not being picked up if you just look at R&D. So I think it's important to really look at these indicators very carefully. We are trying to go beyond what we typically have, which are things on R&D and a few other things, to say, well, we need to look a little bit further. I mean, that doesn't tell you enough about what is going on in the sector. Your point about failure, I think, is a very important one. I mean, I think that is a big problem when we're talking about the link between innovation and entrepreneurship. I mean, it's one thing if you're trying to have a company which can be created and grow and so on. The problem is also to let it fail and basically say, well, and then to have somebody start again. Because one of the things which we know is that basically people who have failed, who have been an entrepreneur, and who will try again are usually much better the second time than they were the first time. And there is a learning process going on here. So failure is actually very important for innovation.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to comment on that? Okay, if not, your turn.
Yeah, my name is Marius Malin. I'm the Senior Transport Specialist of the International Labour Organization, the United Nations agency based in Geneva. I would like to refer to the very theme of this panel discussion, which is public sector leadership. The previous speakers, particularly Mr. Pilar and Mr. Sandar, demonstrated the leadership of the role of governments in innovation with some examples about, for example, the leadership can be demonstrated by steering innovation, or creating standards for innovation, or regulating innovation, or innovation through innovative policies, etc. My question is, how about the governments demonstrating leadership by applying innovation in their own activities? And I would like to refer to border crossing. Hundreds of studies, previous ECMT, nowadays ITF studies, ILO studies, UNEC studies, World Bank studies, demonstrated that the governments are obstacles to innovations at border crossings, where the ministers of transport, who have the responsibility for efficient, safe, and sustainable transport between borders, and they do their work very well. When it comes to border crossings, they don't have, it seems, at least in the projects that I have been involved, they don't have any jurisdiction. And when millions, billions are spent to bypass physical obstacles by building bridges and tunnels through innovative means of construction, in order to save 10 minutes of driving time, then you have the drivers and the goods and the passengers waiting for 40 hours or 10 days at the border crossing, because the governments are not willing to introduce innovative border control methods to allow trade and passengers to go through border crossing. So I would like to see the governments demonstrating their leadership by applying innovative systems where they have full control, and this is border crossings. If they cannot do it, they can invite the private sector to develop innovative systems. How to fight corruption, there are systems where you can fight corruption. So this is my question. How do you see the governments being encouraged to apply innovative systems at border crossings, which is a problem which has been identified by most of us here? When I was working at the World Bank under Mary Yvonne, there was a study that border crossing of commercial trucks should not take more than 45 minutes. Yes, and it takes sometimes 40 hours. Thank you very much.
Oh boy, I feel like saying touché. And as a former government officials and many others in the room, it's hard to disagree with you. At the same time, there are success stories as well. Ms. Brogan talked about the need to have pilot tests and so on, and there are efforts in that sense. I can't disagree with you. At the same time, could someone come to the rescue here and use best practice where there's been successful attempts to deal with that, if not for the entire border at important critical border points? I think you're absolutely right. Yes.
In an ILO report, we have a success story, pretty good to practice between Canada and United States.
Yes.
But these are two very friendly countries. They have limited problems.
Yes, but I don't want to be too parochial
easy
here,
to, but it's a success. It's a success story. Yeah.
So Ms. Alice would like to help me. No.
Is this mic working? Yes. I didn't actually, unfortunately, have a specific answer on the border crossing issue and the benchmarking kind of a best practice, but I did want to make one point which I think is relevant for the whole session, which is the kind of fundamental difference between public sector and private sector, which puts the public sector at a disadvantage, which is that there's no such thing as a bottom line. The example of rail freight was an excellent example of where the discipline of the market and the discipline of the bottom line drives people to do the right thing. In government, however much we try to measure our performance, there is no such thing as the bottom line. It's very hard, therefore, to make certain trade-offs and make difficult decisions. Now, I think we need the cooperation of the industry and our stakeholders to actually put that pressure on us to find better ways of measuring things so that there can be benchmarking, there can be, performance driven out of the public sector. And this will be increasingly important as we face fiscal consolidation and drive for productivity. So if people can come up with proxies for how governments could be subjected to the discipline of the market, I think that would actually drive a lot of good behaviours, both within governments and between governments.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'd like to take one more comment or question and then perhaps move to the next three speakers. Yes?
Hi, I'm Nisha Pill and I work for the BBC and I know nothing about transport. And I'd like to ask a positive question.
Go for it.
Which is of Ms. Brogan, please. And that is, you were talking about these test areas. And I wonder if you could tell us and give us an example or a story of the kinds of things you've tested out and what the outcomes have been.
That's a good question.
Yeah, there are many different types of test areas depending on what kind of test you need to do. But when we talk about these test areas, is that you need to provide some type of a platform or some type of an arena where you can actually test out new technologies or new concepts or new services in a real condition. Because many of these, specifically when we talk about an area that has a very systemic approach where the different pieces hang together in a way that you never simulate in a lab. And one area, for example, here where we are looking to build a new test site in Sweden is in the area of active safety. And there it's not just technology, it's also how the human behavior under certain conditions actually will look like. And you cannot sit in a lab and simulate how a driver would act when there is suddenly a moose or something in front of you. You actually have to test that under almost real conditions. So, I mean, it's you can of course test it out on the real roads, but then since there is a lot of it's not foolproof yet, it might not be the best way of doing it. But to do it under conditions that you both can control, but also almost simulate the real conditions, and that is the only way to sort of really take a big step in for new technologies, new concepts, etc. Was that the answer to your question? Or you need more?
Yeah, but thank you for the question. It does open the whole chapter of the challenge of how to measure the impact of innovation. But we won't go there. So let's now move to our next three panelists, starting with Ms. Alice.
Right, thank you very much.
I hope you didn't steal your thunder from your last intervention.
Yes, I'm going to really try and build on the views that have been mentioned and not repeat too much of what has been said, because I do agree with a lot of the things that have been mentioned, and bring a perhaps slightly alternative perspective. None of us need reminding of the importance of innovation. I've mentioned the fiscal consolidation. In that context, we're going to need to find lots and lots of ways of delivering transport in a smarter and cheaper way. And innovation will play an absolutely key role in raising our productivity there. And a lot of the sort of traditional policy prescriptions are well known. They've been mentioned here, creating stable frameworks, making sure there's markets and competition, targeting taxes and subsidies in the right kind of ways, investing ourselves in R&D and so on. And indeed using regulation to drive certain standards. But I wanted to be a bit controversial and challenge the received wisdom a little bit. I tended to agree with the received wisdom of government's job is to create that framework, and then we need to let the markets and private sector deliver the innovation. But what we tend to forget often is that the private sector and companies are also run by individual human beings. We know now from kind of psychology and other places that human beings don't always act what we believe is rational. And I think our policies are slightly too predicated on us assuming that companies act rationally. So I'll just take 2 or 3 examples. First of all, I recently saw some research by McKinsey looking at where do companies put their resources? You'd think it's the growth areas, the businesses that make the most money or the businesses that are growing the fastest. But in fact, the biggest or the best explanatory variable of where people put their resources is what last year's budget was. This, to me, doesn't sound very innovative behavior. It means that people in the private sector as well as in the public sector are basically misallocating resources enormously and not providing the growth that is required in some of these new kind of up-and-coming technologies. My other example is really just the fact that we know people are very risk-averse. We're hardwired to avoid losses and not perhaps to put quite as much effort into gains. And what that means is if you combine that with the fact that a lot of innovation has to fail, we've already discussed that, you have to take risks. It means that the benefits, the prize to winning, the prize to the actual winning success stories has to be absolutely enormous for the average person to go after it. And this becomes socially unacceptable because then you see people cashing in. So I think there's some really interesting dilemmas there. So what? What can we actually do? Well, I don't think some of those other policy predictions should just go out the window, but I think we can complement it. And just to be brief, I've summarized it in 3 Ps, which are portfolio, people, and psychology. And the portfolio bit is really important, has been mentioned already. We need to have a kind of new economics of innovation which accepts that there's going to be a lot of failure, there's going to be a lot of investment that doesn't deliver a return in its own right. But in the long run and in the sense of a portfolio return, it still continues to make sense to invest. In terms of people, I really wanted to draw attention to research around diversity. We know from research that the more diverse the group of people that solve certain problems in terms of their backgrounds, education, life experiences, the better the solutions. And I think that's a kind of structural thing we can start working on in order to deliver innovation faster and better. And finally, psychology. A lot has been made today about some of the organizational structural barriers and behavioral barriers around sharing information, collaborating. I think we need to get much smarter about understanding how we work as organizations, as policymakers, so that we can be more collaborative across boundaries. And that isn't just kind of taking the received wisdom, but it's also actually having a look at how we can change our own behaviors to deliver more innovation. So hopefully that's an alternative perspective to share. Thank you.
All great points. Thank you very much. We now move to Mr. Paquet.
Thanks. Well, I think that public sector leadership in innovation is quite a tall order, but quite frankly speaking, after all the panelists and in front of an audience of public leaders who unleash innovation every day is even a taller order for me. But let me still, nevertheless, make a few remarks. I mean, I think firstly, I'd like to say that I think that the European transport system is much more sophisticated and innovative than the impression that arises now may convey. I think that maybe in rail freight, Europe has not achieved its potential, but if you look at passenger transport, for example, I think that there are quite impressive success stories here also. And second, if you look at the indicators for innovation, I mean, research and development is indeed certainly lacking in terms of funding, but at the same time, many of the technologies which are necessary to develop the transport system, to integrate the transport system further, would already be largely available, and the issue is very much now for public administrations and for businesses to take these research results up and deploy them effectively. So why is it such a tall order for public administrations? I mean, it has been said, let me just try to recap it from my own perspective. I think it's a tall order because we're talking about a system, and this is also why we need public leadership. If it was a more focused activity, probably businesses could largely lead on innovation, because we have a systems approach which has multiple actors, multiple components, with several modes of transport, and with freight and passenger. I think this does require public leadership. The multiple actors are public and private, but they are also all the levels of governance. We mentioned cities, but you also have regions, you have states, and they all act in the transport system with sometimes rather different perspectives and requirements. And organizing this interaction is particularly difficult in a system, and is also a particular hindrance to innovation. I think also the fact that public administrations are working with for citizens, for businesses, also exposes public administrations to a degree of short-termism, which is also not necessarily an easy ingredient of innovation. If you look at the multiple components, infrastructure, services, vehicles, fuels, propulsion systems, IT, and I'm certainly forgetting some, for all of them, several new available technologies are there, as I said earlier on, but the issue is to deploy them consistently and on a geographical coverage which does make sense. And this is also, I think, something which the public sector has to deal with, and which is maybe the tallest order of all. And again, as I said earlier on, the fact that you have several modes of transport which you need to combine to make them most effective, and freight and passenger, does not make it easier. So how do we go about that at European level, in the European Commission, with member states and other European institutions? I mean, I don't think we do it necessarily very differently from what member states do and what you do in other parts of the world. I think the first thing we try to do is to gather a reasonable degree of a decent information and analytical basis. And one feature of public policies at European level which is gaining importance is ex post policy reviews. I mean, we are attaching increasing importance to that. I mean, 5 years ago, this used to be considered as a bureaucratic obstacle, one more when you were preparing an initiative, but today this is becoming a rather useful, necessary, and sophisticated tool to ensure that you get the starting point right. I mean, then you need to create, with public consultations and with stakeholders, as much as you can of a shared vision for the future. And the European Commission, with member states and Parliament, as I said, is trying to do that, including in the transport area. Once you've done that preliminary work, you can then can come with a number of frameworks. And I think the frameworks were already mentioned. Let me just give you 3 or 4 which are emerging at European level, which will be, I think, quite important for the emergence of an integrated, efficient, low-carbon European transport system. And the first one is that the European Union is discussing a strategy for 2020, a new economic and social strategy, the Europe 2020 strategy, which was presented by the European Commission in March and which is now discussed with member states' parliament. And I think that the heads of states and government will have largely confirmed it and will finish their work on that by the summer. On the basis of this 10-year strategy, the European Commission, Vice President Kallas and Director General Mobility and Transport, but not only this Director General, across the European Commission, with colleagues dealing with the environment, with regional policy, with industrial policy. I mean, in reality, transport, and I failed to mention that earlier on, is maybe also a difficult sector because it covers all economic and social sectors in a way or another. It's preparing a white paper on the future of transport, and there will be 3 main pillars in the white paper. What we call the internal market, which is essentially transport services, and here the issue of borders within the European Union are, of course, not of the same nature, but nevertheless you still have obvious hindrances between markets of member states, in particular in rail transport, which are still to be overcome to have effective transport services within Europe. So the internal market, secondly infrastructure, and thirdly innovation. Innovation is going to be one of the 3 pillars of this white paper, which should set out the transport policy measures for the next 10 years. But we will do that against a vision for low-carbon European integrated transport system at the horizon 2050. And we are working on that on the basis of a number of studies. I'm just going to give you 4 of them, and there are many more, but I think they are quite interesting. One is a UK study, which you certainly know, which is the Future of Mobility Roadmap from the Smith School in Oxford. A second one is a study done with research funding by the European Commission, which is called Freight Vision. So a roadmap, if you want, for low-carbon freight transport by 2050. And then we also are using a study which was presented this morning, done by Accenture, supply chain decarbonization, which is also a very interesting study. And last but not least, the European Commission also is working on a study called European Union Transport Greenhouse Gases Reduction, obviously, Routes to 2050. So on the basis of these 4 pieces of research and many others, and ongoing stakeholder consultations, will also have a vision for low-carbon transport 2050. I think the vision thing is not overrated or overdone in the case of innovation and transport. I think without that, the investment which you make in innovation and infrastructure, which are heavy investments, which take a decade sometimes to materialize, then are the transport system in 2050. So you certainly need that. And on the basis of this white paper, we will come forward with a new European infrastructure policy based around a European core network, planned with member states, but at European level. That is a very significant piece of European public innovation. We will also have a strategic transport technology plan, which should allow to focus and ensure impact on European and member state funding in transport research. We don't have that yet, and this is badly missing. And such a transport technology plan should also ensure continuity between research activities, demonstration, and deployment. And last, there will also be a quite interesting initiative from the Commission in 2011 on clean transport systems, where we will look not only at the electric car, but we will look at all modes of transport and look at the entire chain from fuel, propulsion systems, vehicles, infrastructure, to ensure that there also we have a fine blueprint to ensure that we create a useful framework both for member states and for industry and citizens to move towards a different transport system. Sorry, I think I was a bit too long. Sorry.
No, but that was important. And finally, Mr. Robson.
Thank you. Last but by no means least. So let me start by saying that I don't believe, that governments are great innovators at all. I think instinctively they seek to control developments and work within the status quo. Very often they don't like change. Real innovation cannot be controlled or steered. It has to develop freely. It comes from the bottom up, and most often from people who are challenging the existing system. Sometimes these people are seen as rebels. And in fact, when I was 18, 19, 20 working in the railway, indeed I was seen as a rebel because I challenged everything. And sometimes managers don't know how to deal with rebels. And that, I think, comes back to the point you made about people. People who are rebels and challenging things are not necessarily bad people. Oh, I hope not, anyway. But they're challenging things because they want to improve things. Where public policy and government does have a role is in creating a framework in which innovation is fostered and encouraged. Government should ensure that markets are regulated in such a way as to allow open competition, as competition is a spur to innovation. And indeed, I could spend a long time debating the US freight system via the freight system in the UK, but I would say there's been a lot of innovation within the UK because of competition. And that's perhaps one of the things that's lacking in parts of Europe. Standardisation is actually very, very important to set a framework in which you can innovate, but ensuring that the technologies that people are coming up with and innovating actually work together. Integrated transport systems, intelligent transport systems are all part of that. And government, has been said before, has a key role in supporting promising inventions in their early stages before they're strong enough or widely accepted to be supported by the market. As an example, should governments be doing more to provide the infrastructure to improve the take-up of electric vehicles, charging points, etc. That's an example. That being said, I believe that railway infrastructure managers do have a role to play in innovation in the transport sector. Indeed, some might say that they are in a unique position, as they're both an executive branch of government, because with the exception of one in Europe, they're all totally funded by the government and are accountable to the public, while also interacting constantly with private companies, our suppliers, but also people who are using our network. And this dynamic connection between private companies and passengers can be a strong stimulus for infrastructure managers to act as an innovator. Currently, I don't need to tell you about the financial crisis, but that still means that infrastructure managers and railways need to provide a service which seeks for us to look for innovative ways of doing so. People still want punctual trains. They still want them to be environmentally friendly. They want good access and better access, and they want them safe. So the old saying that necessity is the mother of invention or innovation is quite true, because we never have enough money to do all these things. What I'd like to do is to try and link innovation to some examples from ProRail, because I know it's getting on and you've listened to a lot of talking. So you can just watch one or two slides on here, not too many, I promise. The first one is about driving effectively. Doesn't matter whether it's a diesel train or an electric train. If you drive it properly, you can save energy, saves costs, allows us to reduce our costs and gain more traffic. Different types of fuels. There's long debates about the different types of fuels here, but we need to think about the different fuels. This is a biofuel and sustainable. Electrification, provided the electricity is from regenerative sources, is a very good, efficient, environmentally way of doing things. Along the side of the railway, you will see there are some electricity pylons there which have windmills on. We're actually building wind-generating windmills alongside our railway. It goes direct from the windmills straight into the track. There's no leakage. It's also, I have to say, very good publicity, because you can say to the customers you pass, look, that's what's driving your train. But it makes good business sense to us. Then if we look at the electric cars, a way of improving mobility, but also a way of attracting people to use stations. If we build new stations and we have charging points there for them, They perhaps come and use us rather than use some other mode of transport. We have huge stations. Those of you who arrived here by train at the Hauptbahnhof at Leipzig, think of the amount of glass in that roof. And if you covered that with solar panels, how much electricity could you generate? New stations that are being built in the Netherlands are being built with solar panels in the roof. As it happens, we do it in our homes. Why don't we simply, and perhaps this is where public policy needs to do something, legislate that say we have to install them? No, it's straightforward if we want to do it. And then we come on to two things here which you'll say, a mobile workspace and a video inspection train. They mean nothing. But really, as infrastructure managers, we have great difficulty in providing more capacity on our network. We can't afford very often to build new lines, so we have to use the capacity more effectively. So the video inspection train is taken from the Japanese example, the Dr. Yellow, the yellow train, which goes around their high-speed networks. But the innovation here is that this train goes around all of the network, and then the data from that train goes to a data warehouse, and instead of getting loads and loads and reams of paper, it's sorted so the manager actually gets useful information which allows him, because of the frequency of the runs, to look at his track and predict and prevent things happening rather than fix and mend. In other words, he's being proactive rather than reactive, but he's not being deluged with lots of paper. And the mobile working train, one of the big dangers on the railway, surprise, is being knocked over by a train. And regrettably and sadly, we do kill people. And sometimes that's because of their mistake, sometimes it's because of a bad system. But in effect, this train puts a protective shell around people, which means instead of closing 2 tracks for the staff to work on to ensure they're safe, we only close 1. So we gain 50% of capacity. So these are how to use things which are there in an innovative way in order to meet business needs. And that really is one of the key things from that. So that's just some examples of what we're doing. And I think to sum up, there are some key factors which I'd just like you to think about. Innovation requires creativity within the organisation. I think we've all said that. But leadership needs to be there, and leadership needs to be prepared to support these ideas. And the point's been made once or twice. You might have 5 or 10 bad ideas, but you might have 90 good ideas. Let's support and remember the good things, not as we always do, remember the bad things. And we are all guilty of that. You all remember bad customer service, but you very seldom remember the fact that on 90 days, 8 of 100, you get good customer service. Turn that round. We need to cooperate between different areas of the business to ensure that within a company or within a logistics chain, that innovative ideas are supported. There needs to be a financial stimulus to innovation. One of the things ProRail is doing in its procurement policy, which we mentioned before, is actually to have a CO2 performance ladder. And if you meet certain thresholds as a contractor in terms of your performance, in reducing CO2 in your business, your price can be slightly higher and it's reduced by a percentage because you are a good supplier. That's a way to get people to do things. And government has a role, as we've said, in public policy to stimulate and promote innovation. One of the things that saddens me a little bit, having sat up here, and I'm surprised Marco hasn't said anything, I haven't heard very much about what the customers want. If we're innovating things, they must be there to serve the customer's needs. And that customer may be the end customer, or it may be some customer within the company. But for goodness sake, that's one of the key things I think that innovation should do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time flies. We have about a little more than 20 minutes to go. I'd like to invite comments and questions again, but being very kind of focused. What's unique about this event is that we do have political leaders from more than 50 countries around the world being here tomorrow, and some will stay for Friday. And what are the messages that we'd like to bring to their attention? What are the top 3 messages that we'd like to bring to their attention coming from this panel? Not to take anything away from what was said, and please, if this raised any questions in your mind, let's hear those questions. But I'd invite you to keep in mind about what those messages, what are those messages that we should bring back to ministers. I saw this hand at the back first, and then, sir, and the third one here.
Hi, Peter Fries from Auto 21 in Canada. I guess if I had a politician for a couple of minutes in an elevator speech, the key message I would want to deliver is that innovation isn't something that is ever done. I think there's often a temptation to sort of do a program and say, well, okay, that's looked after now. It's like painting a fence. You don't have to paint it every day. You just paint it the odd time when it needs painting. Innovation isn't like that. If you stop doing it, then you fall behind very rapidly because other people don't stop, but also your people lose their knack of doing it. You lose the people who know how to do it, and so on. So it's something that's never done. I think that's a key thing.
Okay, thank you for that. I saw two more hands, but then it was just a gentleman in the back, so I'm going to cheat, okay, because those two hands came up at the same time. So gentleman in the middle.
Thank you, Tony May, University of Leeds, England. I wanted to respond to your request, but also to come back to something that Sundar said in the first set of presentations. And he drew a distinction between innovation in technology, innovation in policy, and innovation in governance. And it seems to me all of those are needed. And before that, Dirk Pilat made a very interesting comment. He said, I think I can more or less quote, "We all want to learn." My experience, particularly dealing with local government, is many local government agencies don't have time to learn. They don't have time to think, to realise that something new is out there. So for me, there's a very important fourth area of innovation, which is innovation in ideas transfer.
Yes.
And that, I think, is something which governments have a particular role in doing, particularly in their relationship with local government, regional government, city government, and also, if I can move to Monsieur Paquet, as between the European Commission and national governments, and encouraging those national governments who are less effective to be more so. So I'd be very interested in the panel's comments on how well government bodies can help lower-tier government bodies learn more effectively.
Thank you very much for that. Sir. Yes, I think this, gentleman here. Yes.
Thank you very much. Pat Mangan from the Irish Ministry of Transport. Can I put an alternative view to the panel, and I suppose based on sometimes bitter experiences of over 30 years as a government official? Is there a case for government getting out of the way of innovation and of innovators? I feel today that there's too much expected of government in society. Government must do this, government must do that. There's too much dependence on government. And there's a risk that will actually stall innovation while people wait for government to provide structures or funding support or whatever. And as I say, government's expected to do all sorts of things. It's expected to create jobs, which it can't. It's expected to save people from themselves from the cradle to the grave, literally, at this stage. And government's not particularly agile. Indeed, agile government is a bit like military intelligence. It's a contradiction in terms. Government is risk-averse, yes, as the point made by Tara earlier on. And that's very real, because the cost of failure to politicians and public officials is enormous, because it's criticism by the media and by the public if money is seen to be, quote, wasted, despite the fact that some people have made the point very rightly that in innovation there will be failures. We're not good at allocating resources, a point again made by Tara. Public servants are not trained as innovators. Their whole life is driven by the status quo, by precedent, to borrow the phrase, not natural rebels. So my question is, should we not get out of the way?
Okay, well, that's a good one. Can we just pause? I mean, surely there's some comments from the panel on that, or do we let that go and let him get away with it?
Thank you. Hello? Yeah, it's working. Well, if I go back, a long time in the railway industry. When I worked for British Rail, I went on a management course. Surprise, surprise, at the Manchester Business School, along with a lot of managers from across the whole of the world. And their impression was that rail managers were poor managers. And before I could answer the question, the tutor of the course said, no, actually they're some of the best managers in the country. Your perception is they're bad managers because they are managed simply to reduce costs. Service and everything didn't matter. And the reason I use that analogy, I think if you put people to manage in a different frame, to a different set of objectives, they will deliver something very differently. And I think what you're saying is right. We should allow more room for rebels and different thoughts and perhaps train managers how to be leaders, both in government and private industry, to allow people to accept that people have very different views, and those views might not be wrong and might actually lead to a good way. So I think training and leadership and management are really key. And yes, if I was 21 again, I would be a rebel. Yeah, I hope the rest of you in here would be as well.
On best practices and exchange of best practices, I mean, this is clearly a central focus of activity also at European level, and it's in fact one of the elements of the toolbox we have at European level to develop policies with member states. But nevertheless, we certainly still don't do enough of it. But I mean, I don't think I want to entirely reply to the question from my Irish colleague, but I don't think we can step out of the way. I mean, I said that in my comments earlier on. The systems approach which is required in transport simply makes it indispensable that we're there. Let's say that from the point of view of the European Commission, I think we have one feature which does make us somehow innovative, certainly not enough, and we maybe don't do it well enough, but we are by essence creating an internal market, and with that dismantling barriers and bringing operators and member states to practice transport operations differently. So I think this, in the very essence of the European project, is driven by innovation. So I think that helps us to keep that, and that aspect is also quite rewarded in our administration. But another interesting feature of the Commission administration, which is not always present but has been in the past, that we managed, and I suppose some member states do it also, to bring together in the same team people from the research sector and people from policy work. And if you look in Europe at the main traffic management systems for rail, the real ERTMS for rail, if you look at air transport and the CESAR project, if you also look at ITS, and not to mention Galileo, which is still a bit at the middle of the road, but nevertheless a highly ambitious project. In all cases, the concept or the architecture was developed by research, but by research of people who were working with policy people and who stayed in these teams to then ensure that you had demonstration and deployment in the real world. I think that is quite an interesting example, which we will try to emulate ourselves, because we probably have lost it then in the last 10 years we've done it less, and we hope that with the strategic transport technology plan we can find that formula again, to have younger people with innovative thinking and new ideas come in, and then also ensure that it's being seen through over the next 6 or 10 years.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I think the question from Ireland about should we just get out of the way? Well, I think there are areas where government probably should be getting out of the way. I mean, we've been recently doing roundtables in different countries about some of the work which we've been doing in innovation. And I won't mention a country, but it was one country where basically they said, well, we have about 1,500 different support programs at a national, regional, and level and so on to support industry in terms of innovation. Well, that's probably far too much. I mean, that's crazy. And there's a lot of room, I think, in definitely in certain countries in the OECD to rationalize and to really look very hard at basically what are the policies we have? Do they make sense? Do they give value for money? Are they the right thing of we should be doing? So I think it's very important to think very hard about the toolbox which you have. Is it still relevant? Is it still doing the right things? And are you achieving something with it? I think there's always, I mean, you were just talking about, well, it's just about framework conditions. And I think then if we go into, well, what are these framework conditions, we might get to different things about what actually these framework conditions are. I mean, I think I'm an economist by training. My macroeconomic colleagues would basically say, well, it's just about getting markets right and then everything will fall into place. Whereas I think here the audience probably will say, well, we probably need standards, we probably need regulation, we probably need to have certain further conditions to make sure that everything is moving in the right direction and that the right incentives are there. So I think we will always have some arguments about what is the right palette, what are the right tools which have to be in there. But I do think we need a little bit more than just those very general framework conditions, because a lot of countries who have tried that basically found there was not a lot of innovation happening anymore.
Yes. This has indeed triggered a good reaction. Thank you.
Yeah, a few words on that question as well. I worked all my life on the business side until half a year ago when I joined Vinnova, and I definitely don't think that the government should go in and micromanage innovation. But I think it's the responsibility of the government actually to support that innovation can happen. And that goes all the way from education of people, as you talked about being an extremely important element of getting in innovation, as well as provide those arenas where actually innovation can take place, and also provide funding for the risk-taking that we need to have in order to make some breakthroughs. So I think, yes, need support, but should not be the one that controls things into the details.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, yes.
If I were to answer the question that you asked of the audience,
yes,
what message would you like to give to the politicians present here? What I'd like to tell them is that there are enough technologies available, there are enough ideas available, there are enough successful experiences carried in some cities of the world, that we do not need to wait for Mr. Picard's solar-propelled aircraft to take off. The politicians can apply these technologies, these experiences to their cities, to their states, and to their nations to improve transport systems. So while they should encourage innovations, not come in the way of innovations, they should not wait for innovations to happen as though they have nothing to do just now and wait for something to happen. This is the message I'd like to,
that's an excellent
give
point.
them.
Yes. There was a hand up. Yes.
Carsten Hess with Deutsche Post DHL. Actually, it was a bit similar to what we heard from the Irish colleague here. I mean, maybe to change the question a bit then, I mean, is the Commission or the OECD capable of measuring how much money we waste and how much CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions we release because of inefficient markets or inconsistent regulation? Talking about Europe, we recently had the Monti report. If you look at page 51, I mean, it looks disastrous after so many years, not really completed single market for transport. I'm glad to hear from Jean-Éric that the Commission will make proposals. But then, again, it will go through the legislative machinery and we will see what will come out at the end. But if we would have, for example, a figure, I mean, look at the probably annual revenue created by Europe's logistics industry is €1 trillion a year. So if we would have a figure to support, like if we complete a single market, we would probably save 300 billion cost for European industry and that amount of greenhouse gases. Would that help in the political process? So what are we dealing with? How big is the problem? And talking about inconsistency of regulation, I mean, on one hand, we want to increase charges for trucks. On the other hand, we don't allow trucks to be fully loaded because we restrict cabotage, actually something the UK government also voted against for liberalization of cabotage on road. So just to give you some examples, how much could we shift money into innovation by just doing the obvious thing and liberalizing markets and remove red tape? Thank you.
No, I think it's a fair point. And your point basically is that we're promoting the steering of innovation because there are market failures, because this is a sector that's heavily subsidized, because modes do not operate in a highly competitive environment, and on and on. And you're saying maybe energies should be directed to fixing that as opposed to... But to the extent that for whatever reason, we cannot fix that, or there's not the political determination to fix that, then it comes as a package. And therefore what follows is that if you cannot address directly the market failures and everything else I mentioned, then I think logically you would promote the steering of specific policies that are more focused. I'm glad that's before us because I think that's really part of the debate. I think we can take a couple more questions. Yes, sir?
Yoshi Hayashi from Nagoya University, Japan. I would like to suggest to pay more attention on developing countries and climate change negotiations. Perhaps not many of you know that clean development mechanism for transport schemes. There have been already more than 2,000 projects approved, but only 3 projects have been approved for transport. It's really unfair. Okay? So looking at the data, forecasting data, today developing countries' car share, number of cars is only 20% or less of the whole world. But still, there are a lot of mega cities who are suffering from tough congestion and emissions. The year 2050, 20 times more cars are developing countries only in China, India, and Southeast Asia. What would happen without investing railways in particular? Can you imagine a city like London, 20 million population, without railways? The number of megacities over 10 million will be maybe perhaps a double of today's figure. So that means 15 or 20 megacities without railways that we cannot imagine. So because there are politicians here, transport ministers, I would like to ask you to push your government to promote more transport schemes in climate change negotiations. What we need is the United Nations is requesting very stupid method to assess the effects of carbon emission reduction. We are requested to very precise forecast. In the case of a power generation station, it's very easy because they are set of machines can be calculated. But the case of introduction of one line of metro, it's very difficult to assess, but they request. So I have already commenting much as representing the World Conference on Transport Research. We are now proposing, rather than project, one by one project assessment, but whole program for 10 years. 5 metro lines will be completed. Then we can calculate scientifically rough balance, model share, etc. Sorry, I'm talking too much, but because negotiators don't know about transport, so we need our power to push them to promote transport. Thank you.
Okay. So there is one response from the panel, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah, I just would like to make one comment in reply to Mr. Hesse, saying that indeed one of the successes of the internal market in the 90s was a report by Mr. Cecchini called The Cost of Non-Europe. And I think that a headline figure of that nature, why not integrating the transport sector, the infrastructure, the logistics sector, would indeed be quite useful. So on the basis of the discussion today, I will bring this idea back. But I wanted to just say one thing. I mean, coming from the discussion today, if I may, but also from my experience of the last 6 months, I think that with the negotiations in Copenhagen, with the financial and economic crisis worldwide, but in Europe particularly, if you look at how governments are acting today in the financial and economic and budgetary sector, I think they are ready for innovation. They are being innovative. I know they're being pushed a bit, but innovation is nevertheless happening in Europe in a scale which is unprecedented. And I think that should be emulated in the transport sector, and I'm convinced that there is a lot of interest and energy with the European public administrations to be very innovative in the way we do policy, but also in providing a framework for innovation in transport.
Okay. So thank you for that. With that, I think we need to bring this panel to closure. I'd like to recognize Kurt Van Dender here, from the chief economist from the ITF Secretariat, whose deadline is 8:00 p.m. to bring together a two-pager that will summarize what we said today, because that will feed into debates tomorrow. And I'm sure you'll have no problem bringing that together. But there's 2 points that have come up, but maybe not exactly in the context of messages to ministers. I heard someone say, one panelist say, that see change as opportunity. And I also heard that the new fiscal realities will indeed drive changes, certainly in the years ahead, maybe not for 20 years, but the next 5 years. And if there's something that's on the mind of ministers now, I believe it is how they will, as they go back home, how they will redo their budgets and deal with the new fiscal realities. And that's true for every country around the world. And if I can be parochial for 30 seconds, if I look at all the transformative changes that were achieved in Canada in the mid-90s, they were driven, as much as we were so good and so visionary, they were driven by one fiscal objective, which was to bring the deficit to zero. And that drove a lot of innovation. And in a sense, for me, it's history repeating itself, or at least there's going to be changes, and you might as well look at them as opportunities. Otherwise, you just go home and cry. So there are opportunities here for innovation, and it is true that bureaucrats are not naturally innovative, but if you give them a framework, you give them a challenge, then it's amazing what can be achieved. So that's a first point. The second point is probably a little bit more difficult to convey, but Kurt, I'm sure you'll find the right words. It's addressed to political leaders, and you talked about human nature being what it is. There is a natural aversion to risk. What's amazing, based on a conversation earlier today, is that political leaders can be a huge barrier to innovation for all kinds of good reasons. Their reading of what their electors want, whether it's a minority government or majority government, and what is achievable. But if you look at the truly innovative, transformative changes, they've also come from political leaders who were prepared to take the risk. So I guess the point to drive is the critical role that ministers do play. Yes, innovation comes from the base. Yes, the private sector has huge responsibility. Yes, market forces can generate innovation. But at the end of the day, political leaders have a very critical role, and they should, if that's the only message they take away from this conference, I think it'll be worth the trip to Leipzig. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists and thank you all for the questions, and thanks for being here. Good evening.